Dear friends, this year the Wine Goes podcast is going to hit the 5-year mark, and I'd like to thank all of you loyal listeners to tune in regularly and taking the journey together with me to learn more about the mystical and colorful world of wine. I hope you had a great start into 2024, and I wish you many memorable bottles for this year as well. And if you are new to the show, welcome. And if you like it, don't forget to support the show by subscribing, sharing, liking, and all the jazz. This episode is gonna highlight the cold side of Australia with Emma Symington, Master of Wine. Emma has been working with Wine Australia for more than 10 years now and was kind enough to sit down with me for 2 episodes and introduce us first to the cool climate regions of Australia and then to the many faces of Australian Shiraz, the country's flagship variety, in the second episode, coming up in 2 weeks. These shows are meant for both professionals as well as keen beginner wine lovers who want to get an idea about the lesser known corners and strengths of the Australian wine world. Enjoy! So, Emma Symington, thanks for taking time and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool, and today we're gonna talk about cool climate Australia. I think it's very interesting because if you think of Australia, you certainly think of the more hotter regions, I would imagine, and also like here in Europe at least, think of the bold red wines rather than the cool zesty minerally whites or even cool climate reds. How would you define maybe the Australian cool climates in terms of climatic conditions? Is it really a cool climate from an European point of view, or how would you maybe classify the cool climates in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose just going back a step, picking up off your earlier point that I think people tend to associate Australia with the warmer regions, places like Barossa Valley and so on like that, where you're getting a lot of full-bodied red wines. But there's far more to the Australian story than that. And really, that's because you've got to remember how big Australia is. So Australia as a country is far bigger than Europe. If you fly from Perth over in Western Australia across to Sydney in Eastern Australia, that's a 5-hour flight. It's about 2,000 miles, and you'd be crossing 3 time zones. So Australia is a vast country. It's a continent-sized country. And so when you're thinking about the wine regions in Australia, it should be no surprise that there's a huge diversity in terms of different climates, different geographies, geologies, topographies, soil types, and of course, climatic zones within that. So when it comes to cool climates in Australia, absolutely, there are cool, if not cold climates in Australia. For a number of different reasons. For many of them, really the key reason there's a very cool climate is because of the Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean is the ocean that sits to the south of Australia, and it's a very, very cold ocean. All of the waters comes up from Antarctica, so that, there's no landmass between Australia and Antarctica. So this is a really cold ocean, and it has a very important moderating influence and cooling influence right across the southern part of Australia. So, for example, somewhere like Tasmania, so the island situated off the southern part of Australia, totally surrounded by those southern ocean waters and gets all those cold breezes that come off the ocean too. So it's a really important sort of reason why Tasmania in particular has such a cold climate because of this Southern Ocean. But then there's other parts of Australia which have cool climates for different reasons. So, for example, in New South Wales, you've got a region called Orange. Now, this is about 4 hours drive west of Sydney, but importantly, it's very, very high in elevation. It's actually defined by its altitude. So the 600-meter contour line is the regional boundary, and all the vineyards have to be above that. And some of the highest vineyards in Australia are within this region called Orange, and there are over 1,000 meters. So that is a cool climate region because of this influence of elevation. So you have all these different sort of areas of Australia with some element of cool climate, but for some of them are for different reasons.
And you already mentioned the ocean and the altitude and basically the latitude as well. right? So how would you maybe characterize, or how would you maybe identify cool climate regions in Australia? Which parts are the coolest ones?
Regions towards the southern part of Australia are cool, many of them because of that Southern Ocean influence. So I've talked about Tasmania, places like Mornington Peninsula, which is just outside Melbourne in Victoria, a very cool climate, again, because of that influence of the Southern Ocean. And similarly in Great Southern across in Western Australia, which is in the southern part of Western Australia, again has that ocean influence, so really having a cooling effect. But then elevation has an effect. I've talked about the region of Orange, and there's some other regions up in what's called the Great Dividing Range. So the Great Dividing Range is a mountain range that runs right down that eastern seaboard of Australia, from Queensland all the way down through New South Wales and into Victoria. And it gives elevation to a number of different regions throughout those states, and therefore has a cooling impact. And then in South Australia, I guess the sort of key or most important cool climate region there is the Adelaide Hills. And the clue there is very much in the name. These are hills just outside Adelaide, part of the Mount Lofty Ranges. And there the elevation heads up to about 600 metres, which again has quite an important cooling influence and giving that cool climate effect to the region.
Dear friends, I have to talk to you about something really magical. The last 2 years were quite challenging for me, working at least 45 hours a week as a sommelier, planning our wedding, keeping my workout goals in check, and studying for the WSET diploma on the side. It was not unusual for me to feel sluggish, unfocused, and unmotivated even. But the last 2-3 months were much easier thanks to one product, Magic Mind. This little green drink is a tasty combination of 12 main ingredients, including mushrooms, nootropics, adaptogens, and vitamins, respectively. It was created by accomplished scientists, such as Dr. Andrew Weil. Maybe you know him from the Joe Rogan podcast. And besides boosting productivity, it even helps reducing daily stress with active ingredients like ashwagandha. So instead of drinking 8 espressi a day like before, I just had 1 shot of Magic Mind every day after lunch with 1 espresso, an hour before my study sessions. And I was back in the game, feeling sharper and more focused without the roller coaster effect of any other common stimulants. The awareness, better focus, and to be honest, even better mood has lasted into the late hours at work beyond 10 p.m. Even the taste is quite pleasant, especially if you keep it chilled in the fridge. I think everyone needs a push in his or her daily hustle, and I think Magic Mind could work for you just as well as it has worked for me. And if you want to get it cheaper than others, you can get a staggering 56% off your first subscription via the link in the show notes, or 20% off your one-time purchase if you use the code WINEGHOST20 in the checkout. That's WINEGHOST without the usual S at the end, 20 in the checkout. But you can find everything in the show notes. Now, back to Australia with Emma. Because you already mentioned that these are really cool climates, also from a European perspective. Also, I'm sitting here in Austria and Germany. These are, or most of the regions here in these countries are rather coolish and featuring mostly white wines. How would you compare these regions to the classic cool climate regions of the world, so to say? So in terms of maximum temperature, maybe diurnal ranges or winter dormancy, are they truly cool climate regions, or most like oceanic climates, and or some of them probably also continental, more continental?
Yes, so for example, if you look at Tasmania, so Tasmania sits about 250 kilometres south of the Australian mainland, and as I said, is obviously totally surrounded by the Southern Ocean. So it really is the coldest region within Australia. And I think this is why it is best known for its sparkling wines, you know, made in the traditional method, primarily from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and there's a bit of Pinot Meunier there too. So in terms of climate, it's not too dissimilar to Champagne, but it doesn't have that continentality of Champagne. It has a slightly more maritime aspect, but definitely cool climates, you know, and they get snow and frost and so on throughout the winter. So really is the coldest climate within Australia. That all being said, actually in terms of its production, only about 40% is sparkling, About 60% is still, and there's certainly quite a lot of still Chardonnay and Pinot Noir produced there. But there's also things like Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, Pinot Gris, and there is even a little bit of Syrah too, planted in some of those slightly warmer sites, but made very much in cool climate Syrah kind of style. Oh gosh, some of the other regions are going to be quite different. I mentioned Orange up in New South Wales. So as I said, about 4 hours drive inland from Sydney, and this is very much that continental climate with the influence of elevation giving that cooling feel. So in Orange, in the daytime, in the summer, it might push 30 degrees. It's certainly not going to get hotter than that, but it's got huge diurnal variation. I've been there in the summer and, you've been outside in your t-shirts and it's lovely and warm. But as soon as that sun sets, you need to put a jumper on because the temperature absolutely plummets. And this is what gives that cool climate influence. And again, you get a bit of sparkling wine produced in Orange. But really, those cool climate white grapes are really what it's best known for.
And in terms of grape varieties, what are the most typical ones? You already mentioned some of them, basically the champagne varieties. But what are maybe other varieties that are associated with these cool climate regions like Adelaide or Yarra Valley?
So Adelaide Hills is a really interesting one as a region. As I said, it is cool climate in terms of its overall, I suppose, how you describe its climate, but it is actually very varied as a region. It's quite a big region in terms of area because it's about 75 kilometres north to south, about 20 kilometres east to west, albeit there's only about 3,000 hectares of vineyard within the region. So it's not hugely widely planted. But there is quite a difference in terms of topography. So the highest part of the Adelaide Hills, heading 600 plus meters in terms of altitude, that's where you get sparkling wine. There's a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir made for still wine, Sauvignon Blanc. But then as you head further north and also further east, so a bit more inland, the altitude drops off down to about 300 meters. So those are warmer sites. So this is where you get more in terms of Shiraz. But also many other grape varieties. And the Adelaide Hills is one of those regions where people, winemakers and viticulturalists are really experimenting and innovating and trying out new grape varieties. So it's a real base of people beginning to plant the so-called alternative grape varieties. So there's a number of Italian grape varieties you find up in the Adelaide Hills, things like Barbera, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Montepulciano, Fiano in terms of whites. Interestingly, from your point of view, it's also where Gruner Veltliner has found a very happy home in Australia. And I think there's something like 25 different producers of Gruner Veltliner in the Adelaide Hills. And that's because of that elevation and that big diurnal variation they have in the Adelaide Hills, it seems like Gruner is really well suited there.
And what are the motivations behind planting these varieties? Like, I know that Riesling also has a quite long tradition in the country, right?
Yes.
Why are they looking for these alternative grape varieties? Is it because of the experimentation and maybe seeking greater diversity, or is it because the climate is also a bit changing in these regions?
I would say a bit of both. So today there's more than 150 different grape varieties planted across Australia. And because the regional laws within Australia, of course, the regions are defined and, legally, if you have a region on the label, that is where the grapes come from. But beyond that, viticulturalists and winemakers are really at liberty to plant what they like, where they like, and make it in whatever style they like. So it's very different to some of the stricter appellation laws that we find across Europe. And I think, this pioneer spirit and this desire to push the envelope and always try and do things better next time is really driving this innovation and experimentation. And people are really excited to start planting new grape varieties and try out different things. Now, that all being said, I think there is also growing awareness that perhaps some of the traditional grape varieties that were planted in the first place in some of these regions were not ones that were not best suited perhaps to the regions in terms of climate. And so people are really beginning to understand a lot more now as to which grape varieties are best suited. And a lot of this goes hand in hand, with the global climate crisis and people trying to now plant grape varieties that need less water in the vineyards and perhaps, keep their acid levels at a greater rate. And also, of course, with an eye on the future and understanding what might happen in these regions in 50, 100 plus years' time. So there's a number of different regions, I think, why these alternative grape varieties are becoming more evident, more prominent, and people talking more about them.
Australia being a country of immigrants, I guess a lot of, for example, Italian grape varieties have traditions in places like the King Valley and these areas with, so to say, with the Australian Prosecco, and also with other Italian grape varieties. Do you think that as these old immigrants, so to say, are more integrating into the Australian culture and maybe losing some of this old identity, or this old identity became more vague? Do you think that these other influences, like the Austrian influence and also, I don't know, maybe Hungarian grape varieties or Spanish grape varieties, are becoming more popular because people are seeking something new and maybe, I don't know, looking at also Spanish, so to say, cool climate regions like Ribera Sacra with Mencia and also Albarino, maybe these are becoming also more interesting for Australian producers, and maybe the demand is also there in the Australian market?
So in terms of immigrants, certainly there's been waves of immigration into Australia, particularly from Europe, but also from other countries, and that has really helped sort of impact the culture. And when it comes to viticulture, absolutely, some of these people came from wine growing regions across Europe and kind of brought their social mores with them and their desire to work with some of these grape varieties. So you mentioned the King Valley. So this is inland in Victoria, and parts of that is actually quite high in altitude, so relatively cool in terms of climate. And it's a region that was really settled by Italian immigrants, and it was originally actually a tobacco farming area, but back in the kind of 60s, 70s, that really shifted across to viticulture. And it's one of those areas in Australia where Italian grape varieties are really quite prominent. I've mentioned a load already in terms of, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Vermentino, all sorts of different things are planted there. But I think that Italian heritage and culture in that particular region is still incredibly strong. I was there a few years ago, and there was a salami festival at the Dal Zotto winery, and it was all decked out in Italian flags, and it's obviously very Italian food and produce. There was an Italian band singing Italian songs, and it really felt like a little bit of Italy in Australia. It was fascinating. So I think that culture really has kept going through for a number of these regions which have this kind of strong immigrant population. But in terms of other grape varieties, absolutely, there's experimentation, I would say, across the board in terms of grape varieties coming from different countries across Europe. So, there's Mencia growing really well in McLaren Vale, so just south of Adelaide. There's, things like Sagrantino going very well. Albarino, absolutely. Assertico is now planted in the Clare Valley. So although there is a number of Italian grape varieties, there's also a lot of Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Hungarian, all sorts of different things are being planted and trialed, and wines being made out of them. So yeah, it's an exciting part of the Australian wine story.
And I want to talk about some regions which are maybe not the most well known outside of Australia, and which are maybe not also maybe not the most popular ones on the export market, but these are truly cool climate regions. For example, the Macedon Ranges, which is, if my information is correct, Australia's coolest mainland wine region. Can you talk a little bit about this Macedon Ranges, like as a region? How should one approach a wine maybe which comes from the Macedon regions, or what should we expect?
Yeah, so it's a pretty small region, just not too far from Melbourne. So again, having some cooling influence from the breezes and the cooling impact of the Southern Ocean. You're right. It's not one we see a huge amount of in the export market, but that's really because there's not a huge amount of vineyard area in the region, full stop. And I imagine much of what gets produced probably gets drunk in Melbourne, being that it's on the doorstep. But there is some really high quality wine coming out of Macedon Ranges. So if you do get the opportunity to try some, then I would certainly suggest you do. Probably best known for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Really, really high quality for both of those senses, for both of those grape varieties. Although there is also things like cool climate Syrah grown in Macedon Ranges too. Unfortunately, it's a region I've never had the opportunity to visit, though I hope to very much so one day. And then I'll be able to tell you a lot more. I kind of think with regions, you always need to get onto the ground and get out in the vineyards and, feel the climate, see the soil, and then you really get a good grounding as to what makes it special.
Yeah, I wish. Another such regions would be for me is Beechworth.
Yes.
Which is in the foothills of the Australian Alps, but I guess it's also quite tiny region in northeast Victoria.
Exactly that, and not too far at all from the King Valley, which we were talking about earlier. And Beechworth, I think, is probably best known, obviously, for Giaconda. It's one of the kind of really iconic producers across all of Australia, and Giaconda Chardonnay is going to be up there for one of the very best Chardonnays coming out of Australia. Although they do make other wines too. Yes. So again, Beechworth, it's inland, so it's continental climate, but with that influence of elevation because of where it sits up in the sort of foothills of the Great Dividing Range. So that, that gives that big diurnal variation, relatively warm, sunny days, but very cold nights. So keeping all that lovely freshness and acidity and kind of vivacity in the wine.
And also another interesting and surprising regions would be for me Heathcote, which is also very interesting in terms of its soil type. This kind of iron-rich basalt soils, if I'm correct.
That's
and
absolutely
also
right.
A bit more divided, I would guess.
Yeah, so Heathcote is certainly wouldn't be classified as cool climate, more moderate climate, and probably best known for its Shiraz. It seems Shiraz and Heathcote seem to go hand in hand. It's that soil type; it just suits the grape variety so well. So it's not going to be that kind of full-bodied, concentrated, powerful style of Shiraz that you might get from, say, Barossa Valley. It's got a little bit more restraint to it, but it's certainly not a true cool climate, as are some of the other ones we've been talking about already.
As a young sommelier, maybe, where should I turn my head to in terms of maybe a bit under the radar, coolish climate regions in Australia, maybe except what we mentioned?
Yes, so I briefly mentioned Great Southern earlier, and that's a really quite exciting region. So this is over in Western Australia, but right in the southern part of Western Australia, so further south than, say, Margaret River. It's about a 5-hour drive south of Perth, just to give you some perspective there. And it's a fascinating region. It's actually really, really big in terms of area. So it's about 150 kilometres east to west, about 100 kilometres north to south, but very small in terms of production. There's only about just over 1,000 hectares of vineyard area there. Now, because it is so big in terms of area, it's been divided up into 5 sub-regions. So on the coast, you have the sub-regions called Albany and Denmark. Now, these are very cool climates on the coast, so absolutely getting all that influence from the Southern Ocean. So, Pinot Noir, I'd say, is probably quite dominant there, and Chardonnay. But then as you go inland, you head to Mount Barker and Parongarup. So slightly warmer, a little bit more continental in terms of climate. And this is where you get some amazing Riesling, and really beautiful kind of floral toned dry styles of Riesling, quite different than you see from, Clare Valley and Eden Valley in South Australia, which are probably Australia's most famous regions for Riesling. And then again, further inland, you get to the sub-region called Franklin River. So this is a bit warmer because it's a bit further inland, so further away from that Southern Ocean influence, but it does have a bit of elevation up to about 400 meters. So warmer, but again with that slight diurnal variation. And this is where Shiraz does very well in the Franklin River, but very much made in that cool climate style, that real restrained style, more kind of savory toned than perhaps some of the more fruit forward Shiraz from elsewhere. So yeah, Great Southern I think is really exciting as a region. You know, it's relatively young. The first vineyards were only planted in the 1960s, but there's lots of really brilliant wines coming from that region.
I know you are sitting in England. I don't know how often do you visit Australia, but can you talk a little bit about the trends and maybe movements also, not only from the winemaker perspective, but also in terms of the consumer's perspective? Is there also a greater demand for kind of cool climate wines from Australia, also in the country and also maybe on the export market? What I mean is that is there maybe a greater demand for kind of more low alcoholic wines with a bit more acidity and also with maybe with a bit more precision and less new oak?
I think certainly domestically in Australia, I mean, you have to remember overall it's quite a warm country. So, you know, people do a lot of sitting and eating outside and, you know, eating a lot of fish and, you know, fresh produce. And to have with that kind of food, you need a wine with a certain freshness and acidity and vivacity. And I think there's been a real shift in Australia, not just in the cool climate regions, but really across all regions, to making wines with a bit more freshness and a bit more, you know, liveliness. And we see that even in places, you know, traditional warmer climate places like the Barossa Valley. The wines made there now are totally different to the wines that would have been there, you know, 20, 30 years ago in the time of the Robert Parker wines. You know, now these wines are made with much more freshness. There's a real an eye to keeping that kind of freshness in the wines and a lot less new oak. So allowing that lovely fruit forwardness of the actual grape varieties to shine through. So I think certainly domestically in Australia, there is absolutely a huge interest in the cool climate regions. I can actually give you quite a nice stat on that. So looking at Tasmania on itself in terms of production, 40% of all of the wine made on Tasmania is drunk in Tasmania. Another 55% of the wine is drunk across mainland Australia. That only leaves 5% of Tasmania's production for the export market. So I think that gives you a really nice idea of how celebrated and desired those styles of wines are within Australia. So yes, it's absolutely an important part of the domestic market. And I think as well, the domestic consumers in Australia are really driving this demand for alternative grape varieties. You know, if you go to wine bars in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, you will find any number of different grape varieties, obviously grown in Australia, made in Australia, but tasted by the glass, because that is what people want to try. They want to experiment. They want to try new things. And it is also helping drive that change within Australia.
I tell you my perspective. I work and live in Austria, and I think there is a great maybe connection between the trend, or maybe not even a trend, but a movement towards more sustainable farming and also more sustainable winemaking, and also the wake of biodynamic viticulture, and also the rebirths maybe also in these countries. And it's a great connection with the climate change here, and there is a lot of talk about also not only maybe future varieties, but also how to conserve maybe this kind of coolish climate continental treasures, so to say, in Germany and in Austria and even in Switzerland actually. Do you also see a great trend in Australia towards more sustainable winemaking, and also do you maybe also see more winemaking techniques that are more laissez-faire, so to say, so not really very technical, but maybe more in line with the biodynamic practices, not only in the vineyard, but also maybe in the winery?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say in Australia, like many other places around the world, sustainability is the real watchword now. In terms of the wine industry, I think we were slightly perhaps a bit behind the times, particularly compared to our neighbour in New Zealand, where, you know, New Zealand Sustainable Wine Growing in New Zealand was set up in 1995. We set up our nationwide sustainability program 4 years ago, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. But what has been amazing to see is how fast that has taken hold and how many wineries across Australia are now certified sustainable. And looking in terms of organics and biodynamics, absolutely, again, it is something that has been and will continue to be an important part of viticulture in Australia. If you look at a region, for example, like McLaren Vale, and it's often sort of hyped as Australia's greenest wine region. So this is sitting just below Adelaide in South Australia. Over 40% of all vineyards within the McLaren Vale are certified as organic or biodynamic. And obviously many more will be practicing that way, even if they haven't gone through the process of certification. So it really is something that's increasingly important, this, sustainability and associated terms. And I think it's something we'll hear more and more about as time goes on.
Also, because I'm thinking of Penfolds, for example. This is a great company with a great production. Do you see some of these companies also maybe changing their portfolio? I mean, turning away from this overly alcoholic and boldish Parker wines, as you already mentioned, and maybe also changing their plantings portfolio, and what are we looking at in 5 years, maybe, in terms of their production?
Yes, I guess in terms of the big companies, what you have to remember is predominantly they'll be buying in fruit from growers rather than necessarily having a huge amount of their own vineyard area, which, gives them quite a lot of flexibility in terms of what they're looking for. And certainly Penfolds, also Treasury, will be making small quantities of, some of these alternative varieties and selling them through things like their cellar door. They might not necessarily be things we see in the export markets yet, but that's often the way they trial things, doing things in small production, trialing them through cellar doors, and then seeing and deciding what to make on a bigger scale in the future. In terms of, a move away from bigger, bolder wines, I would say you already see that across these portfolios. If you try wines from them now versus what they would have been sort of 20 years ago, I think you would see quite a big difference in terms of, as I said, that freshness, that acid profile, that ability to match with food. Particularly in terms of Chardonnays, pulling back on the amount of new oak, allowing that lovely fruit to shine through with the oak in a more supportive role, rather than necessarily kind of sitting on top of the wine. So I think that is something you're seeing. It's just perhaps been quite a gradual journey. So it's not as apparent, perhaps, as a huge change overnight.
Maybe not an easy question, or not the easiest question for you, but if you are sitting here in Europe or even in the US, I don't want to stay only European focused in this conversation, and you have to name 5 wines or maybe 5 wine styles what cool climate Australia is defined by, what should I buy?
Well, first of all, I'd certainly go out and buy some Tasmanian sparkling wine. Now, in terms of what tends to be available in the export markets, Jantz is pretty widely distributed. House of Arras is probably some of the best Tasmanian sparkling wine. But really, I would say all Tassie sparkling is high quality, traditional method production, and definitely worth seeking out. As I said earlier, though, only about 5% of Tassie production is exported, so not a huge amount gets to the export markets, but certainly worth seeking out if you can. Then, of course, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in terms of cool climates is really a very important category for Australia. If you were looking at Chardonnay, I'd probably be heading to somewhere like the Yarra Valley, some of those higher sites within the Yarra. You just get some absolutely beautiful Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs. Producers like Mac Forbes or Giant Steps are pretty well distributed in export markets, and really absolutely, in my opinion, sit alongside, top Chardonnay and Pinot Noirs from anywhere else around the world. They're really, really fabulous. If you're interested in trying something from Orange, that's the region I mentioned that's very high in altitude, the highest vineyards in Australia. They make some really lovely Sauvignon Blanc, made in a more kind of restrained, kind of minerally style. So well worth seeking out. But again, it's a pretty small region in terms of production, so it's not something we see a huge amount in the export markets. And then when it comes to the Adelaide Hills, we've discussed about how many exciting alternative grape varieties are planted there, and Gruner Veltliner, I think, is always a fascinating one to try from Australia, because obviously it's a great variety that we totally associate with Austria. But it's really interesting to try something from down under too. So again, if you get a chance to try some of those, though they do tend to be made in relatively small production, so it can be harder to get hold of.
Cool. And do you also see, or is it possible to produce maybe the most cool climate still wines in the world? I mean, ice wine. Is it possible somewhere in Australia?
I'm sure it is possible, because certainly up in some of those regions up in the Great Dividing Range, you get a lot of snow throughout the winter. I've not come across personally any ice wine, but that's not to say it doesn't happen.
Well, Emma, thank you very much. It was a really great overview, and I think a lot of insights which are not written necessarily in the WSET workbooks. Would you like to add something, or would you like to highlight something which we haven't talked about?
Oh, good question. I think in terms of cool climate, we've probably covered all of those key regions and key reasons why they're cool climates. And I guess it's just worth finishing really where we started, in terms of how big Australia is and in terms of the diversity. You know, there's 65 different wine regions within Australia, and I mentioned there's 150 different grape varieties planted there. So there is really something out there for everyone, you know, from absolute cool cold climate sparkling wine through whites, reds, rosé, all the way through to, you know, fortified wines. And that to me is what makes Australia so exciting.
In the next episode, if the listeners join us again, I want to talk to you about the evolution of Syrah, and also the importance of Syrah still for Australia, and also probably for the export market, because I guess it's still the signature variety. So if you were up to it, in the next episode, I will talk to you about Syrah, and also maybe the key regions. How is the style of Syrah is changing?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Shiraz really is Australia's calling card. You know, 25% of all production in Australia is Shiraz, and it is grown in every one of those 65 wine regions I've talked about. So there's a huge diversity in terms of Shiraz and Syrah in Australia. And it's a topic I'd love to talk more about.
Cool, Emma. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.